your union license. It appeared that you don't.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
well,
I'll ask about that later.
Yeah.
then.
Sure.
So, but, okay, great. Thank you for letting me be here. My name is Glenn Hager. Currently live in Katy, Texas. My wife, beautiful, wonderful woman that couldn't search the earth for the rest of my life and still not find a better person, actually. Very blessed. She grew up in the Katy area. I grew up in the Hockley area, which is just north of there. So I grew up in a farming family. My family moved here in 1846. Actually, my line got here in 1848. So I grew up in a family community farming over there in Hockley, which is not too far from here. But the fact is that I'm a sixth generation Texan. I actually still stay engaged in the family operation with my dad and my cousin. But besides that, growing up, my grandfather owned some equipment dealerships. I grew up in the equipment dealership business, grain elevator, a family farm in another state, some different properties. So the point being is, I guess we would be, as some people would call it, as a family overall, we have land that we've been blessed to acquire over the years, but asset poor. You own land, but that doesn't mean you have a whole lot necessarily. So after going to college, I moved to Katy because that's where Dara, my wife, is from, and I ran for the legislature in 2002. There was a brand new district in Waller County, which is the county that I grew up in all my life in the northeast corner. And so the fact is, after running for the legislature in the House for 4 years, I've served in the state Senate now since 2007 of 21 counties that I currently represent, and that's anything west of the Houston area, Waller County, on up almost to Travis County, but I don't go there, and then almost to San Antonio and Corpus Christi, yes. So I stay out of the blue bubble. I don't quite go to the blue bubble, but the fact is I'm currently running for Comptroller. So as you know, our current Comptroller, Susan Combs, is not running for re-election, and I was asked quite a while back by a TV station, I might have mentioned this during y'all's candidate forum event, that I was asked a question of, do you think serving in the legislature qualifies you to be Comptroller? And as you know, the Comptroller, which most people have no idea what the Comptroller's position is number one, you're really the chief accountant for the state of Texas, which is the taxpayer. Let's face who those people are. It's the taxpayer. So you're the chief accountant for your state government. You're the revenue estimator for the legislature. You're also the window to open government. I passed legislation in 2007, thought, imagine in the 21st century you can actually go online and see how your money is being spent, down to actually the check, not just knowing by state agency, but all the way down to the line item and to the check. Susan Combs has not just taken that, but ran with it. I want to continue that legacy of open government and transparency to where people actually see how their dollars are being spent, and being asked, is it serving in the legislature that most qualifies you? And my answer is absolutely not. I think that is one aspect of maybe some of the skill set that you have of working with people or actually trying to get complicated things resolved. But I think that it's the fact that I've grown up in the environment where you work and you work and you work. During college, I was the first one in my family to actually graduate from college. And imagine 6 generations. Took 6 generations. But the fact is I never went off to spring break and all of it. Well, I did, but it was actually back home working. And so that's what I've done all my life. And I'm not one to shy away from rolling up my sleeves and working on any issue whatsoever or working on problems. But I think that too often people want to make them too complicated, and in part because they don't want to resolve things. And I firmly believe we live in the best state in this nation. And I firmly believe that growing up, my ability to work hard, to work on my own merits in government, not to pick winners and losers, but to actually give me an opportunity, you an opportunity, you an opportunity. The fact that earlier today we were talking with a business there locally, one of the gun store operators and firing range, that I've been a big advocate of our Second Amendment rights, because why? Those are the things that we cherish very dearly, and those are things that I want to pass on to my kids. And I firmly believe the Comptroller's office is an extremely important office that's more than just the business manager for the state of Texas. And that's one office that I believe that the taxpayers really have to make a careful decision on who they want to be their next Texas Comptroller. So that's just a little bit about me.
Thank you.
All right. You want to go first?
You go ahead so we don't get lost. Go ahead.
You got the head chair, Larry.
Yeah.
I'll turn it over.
Okay, why did you feel comptroller?
Looking at, actually, it was about 2 years ago, after the last legislative session before last. After getting out of the legislative session, I have an 8-year-old daughter, a 5-year-old daughter, and a 5-year-old son. And I think we all have to evaluate, is it time for me to step down, serving in the legislature? Is it my time to move on? Is it time to do something different? And at that time, I talked to my wife, a couple of good friends. I had several people ask me, say, Glenn, you come from a background where your family's been involved in agriculture. Why don't you run for the Ag Commission? And I think that's an important job. It's just not one that I've just been passionate about. And it might have been one day when I was reading something, working on different issues, and knowing that my background and my skill set in our family businesses has always been of economic numbers, of forecasting, dealing with the accounting, working on what is the forecast for the next year, not just expenditures, but income. That's what I'm good at. That's what I do well. I keep the checks and balances. Somebody had asked me not too long ago, they said, what is the hardest things you have to deal with? And I said, about this time of the year where my partners want to go buy new stuff. My dad and my cousin in particularly in our farming operation, and they're not cheap expenditures, you know, and I'm that cheapskate that says, well, hey, why don't we wait another year? And the fact is I think the skill set that I bring better suits me for the comptroller's position. And I firmly believe that that office is one where the window to open government, for example, that didn't exist before 2007. It wasn't at the comptroller. Nobody ever envisioned, let's make sure the comptroller's office. Well, now we're talking about making sure that local debt, how much our local debt is in the state of Texas, and moving the comptroller's office to having that window as well, so you can actually see, because where do you go get that information? And those are things that I've worked on and I'm passionate about, and I think I'm better suited in that position than in the state senate.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay,
Yes, sir?
just quickly, how many pages, pounds, inches is the Texas budget, you know? You ever seen it on the table?
Yeah, I've seen it and I have read through it numerous times, and I try not to do it late at night because it'll put you to sleep, because it's actually about, so thick. So it's gonna end up being probably about 4.5 inches thick.
Okay.
And so it's enormous.
Yeah.
It's actually enormous.
That was just my peripheral question. I was gonna ask about the lottery, that would fall under
Yes, sir.
you, right? I never believed it would happen, but if you believe what you see, the lottery actually contributes about $1 billion a year
Yes,
to
sir,
the
that's
school.
the correct number.
And I have a couple of parts to it. One is the fact that part of the payoff goes to the guy who wins the lottery,
Yes, sir.
but a big old piece, $200 million each, goes to the folks who sell it,
Yes,
and it
sir.
goes to the folks who administer the program. So, and that's grown, of course, as the lottery has grown. I don't know if the overhead has really grown with it or not. But should that be looked at as a source to get $200 million? And if the gambling came to the state, would that also go under you? And how would that be different? And what would be the pros and cons of getting gambling into the state?
If you look at the lottery, say for example, I used to get asked that question all the time. The Texas lottery, does any of it go to public education? And I think people recall back to the commercials back
Yeah,
when
we didn't-
people were, it didn't do what the commercial said it was going to do in essence. But the fact is yes, the vast majority, I think 57% of the lottery goes to public education, and the other 43% goes, if memory serves, and I haven't looked at it in about 2 years, the other 43% goes to exactly where you're saying.
That's
Now,
57 and 43% of the state's half.
Yeah,
The other half goes to the winner.
the other 43%, so you have winter, public education, and then you have, like you said, to the person who takes the chips off the shelf space and the vendor, the person that sold it. But the fact is that I don't personally believe that gambling is a way to fund public education. Never have. I wasn't old enough to vote for it when it got passed. I probably would have voted against it. Now, I personally don't care what you do with your money. I don't care what you do with your money. You want to gamble, that's your personal opinion. I don't personally go gamble, but then on the flip side, who would say, well, yes, you do, because you still farm for a living. So, I'm gonna tell you, I put a big gamble out on the ground every single year. And I would have done it here a few weeks back when we tried to plant our wheat, but it rained too much, so it's still sitting in the sacks. So I do, but that's with my money. But what my point in part is that I don't think gambling should be looked at as a source to fund education. And so the way to answer the last part of your question, in order to have expansion of gambling in Texas, the question is, where's that going to be? Is that casino gambling? Is that at racetracks? Is that at dog tracks? Is that at the Indian reservations? Where is it at? And one of the biggest discussions is where would it be at and where would that footprint be? And so I've never been a proponent for expansion just because I don't see public education as the place to spend.
I think the dog tracks have all gone belly up, haven't they? Except for
They're
one.
the vast majority of them, yes, sir.
Okay.
Dick?
Okay, you've got a lot of good ideas in here, and one of them, one phrase caught my attention, and was in support, or in response to the question on transparency levels.
Yes, sir.
And you want to push a bill in the first legislative session that you're in office that will increase transparency at the ballot box, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe it's just me and I've had my eyes closed, but I don't ever hear about the Comptroller pushing bills. And so could you elaborate on what you mean by that? I know that you have friends in the legislature, you can make those contacts. Maybe you can use some examples of how Susan Combs pushed bills from her position as Comptroller.
Yes, sir, I can. Actually, the piece of legislation there is something that Susan had pushed real hard for this last legislative session. And so therefore, whenever I carried the legislation in 2007 to put that open window to government transparency there, that's not necessarily something that I recall Susan saying, hey, yes, give me that. I don't think that a office holder needs to go and say, hey, let me have this and this and this power. That's not something that I do think. I think number one, as the comptroller, the first thing I need to do is look at the agency and looks at what I call the shiny objects. In other words, the things that distract you and you look at, that takes you away from your core function and your core purpose. And over time, government has those. When I was chair of Sunset Advisory Commission at the Public Utility Commission, say for example, we still had people there regulating your old phone lines as though we have no cell phones in the world. Well, 75% of all communication is cell phones. They have nothing to do with landlines. So I'm sitting here saying, well, why are we spending wasteless money on something that we don't even do anymore? So we streamline that. And my point is, first and foremost, at the comptroller's office, we don't go through that type of sunset review. We need to do that. That's number one, to see what you can get rid of those shiny objects. But number two, the legislation specifically here is something that Susan Combs had promoted and pushed. And the reason, and I support continuing that. I voted for it in the state Senate. I know we passed it out of the committee I was on once, and we may have passed it out twice actually, I forget. But the point of that legislation is to ensure, as you can go see how much money your state government spends and the debt that your state government has, what about all the local governments? Where do you go to get that information? And when I was out in West Texas not too long ago, I had some individuals mentioning to me the problems they had with one of the local districts, how they didn't have that openness. And I think that the comptroller's office should be the place to have that one-stop shop where you can go and find that information, because there's too many local entities out there. And Texas has the second highest debt load per capita out of all the states in the nation, only second behind New York. And I think the public deserves to have that information. And that's directly as an example of some legislation that Susan had pushed and was for this last session. It did not ultimately pass, but it's something she's doing anyway. She's putting it on her website anyway. So she didn't have to have legislation, and she's doing it. And I want to continue that. Hope that answers your question.
Part.
Okay.
Next time
Okay,
around.
sounds good. Okay. Okay.
Not this last legislative session, but the one before.
Yes, sir.
They released a budget, and of course there's a lot of screaming about the money they cut from education, but the truth is, they also shortchanged the budget. They knew ahead of time that when the next legislature, this last one, came in, they would already be under it wouldn't be a balanced budget, they'd be owing in Medicaid. Well, my question is, since the comptroller has to certify the budget, isn't it appropriate for the comptroller basically to look, because the comptroller is supposed to certify that it's a balanced budget, but what about issues of where they're playing games, pulling tricks, claiming, you know, that it's contributing to the taxes, but it's taking away. I'm not sure exactly what, but is there some protection the comptroller can give us regarding honesty from our legislature in the budgeting process? If so, explain to us
Yeah,
how.
no, I think that's a very good question. It's no different than if, say, for example, the legislature as a whole, instead of in shortchanging, if you have a 24-month budget and you may spend 23 months of public education, or which means in 2 years you're going to have how many months? Not 24, but 25.
Right.
And so when you go out and you talk to the public, you can't say, oh, I cut your taxes and I spent less. You didn't cut anything.
Mm-hmm.
You just played an accounting trick. Well, is it a trick? It's a trick if you're not honest with people. That's certainly a trick. But if you're honest with people, you say, either we didn't have the money and this was a way to pass the budget and move forward. But I think that the comptroller should, in all instances, lay out very clearly if the legislature didn't fund all 24 months in the budget for all items, whatever it be, and either cut money or however they make it work, then the comptroller has a responsibility and a duty, just like everybody who voted for or against it, to lay that openness out there and let the public know that you either shortchanged or you did an accounting gimmick, or whether same thing as I make the point with all the GRD dedicated accounts that are being sit with money, taxes being collected, but it's sitting here in an account.
Right.
If it's sitting in an account, what is it used for if it's not spent? It's to certify the budget.
Mm-hmm.
And so therefore, you need to make sure that the public has access to information, no different than you're gonna put this on the website so people can educate themselves and be voters.
Right.
The comptroller needs to make sure that the public has that, because that's who you're going to. You're the chief accountant.
Mm-hmm.
You're the chief financial officer. You need to make sure that all of that is open in the public. Absolutely, yes.
Well, this last, there's only I'll wait till next time around. Go ahead, Larry.
A couple of questions ago, you touched on the shiny objects that are, something that sticks out, and you reevaluate everything in the comptroller's office. Obviously, you've looked at what you're getting into.
Yes, sir.
How updated is the tech systems in our comptroller's office?
The what systems?
The tech system, computer and all that?
Oh, yes. I think, I can tell you, I don't think that our computer system and technology is up to date as it needs to be. In different areas of the state government, the comptroller's office, I think that, especially when we deal with our field offices, we need to make sure that we have a higher level of uniform knowledge and education level out there. I think that might be something that has slipped over the last few years. But then that also means, from a technological standpoint, we don't necessarily have to have bricks and mortars for everybody to go to work. We can actually have them work with an iPad or a laptop from somewhere else. But, with technology has changed that you don't have to spend a tremendous amount of money to come up to speed. But then, say, for example, this last session, the question was the comptroller's office, but with the Railroad Commission, I wanted to make sure that we did spend some money to update their technology. Why? Because the oil and gas industry is booming in this state.
Right.
And if you don't put those permits, and when people are waiting on a backlog to get going, that's costing jobs, and that's costing those businesses. And I think that that's a disservice to the public. And so therefore, if you're paying those taxes, put the money in the investment to where you can go get your permit and you can get started. And so I pushed hard to make sure that we appropriated dollars to do specifically that. So that was spending money in an instant, but it's also paying dividends. In 2015, we're actually going to potentially be a larger producer of oil than Saudi Arabia, which is pretty phenomenal. And so I do think the comptroller's office needs to be updated, but you have to be reasonable, and you have to have a timeline and a business plan to where you do those updates over time. You don't do it overnight.
6 seconds left, that's pretty good.
All right, start over.
I tell you what,
You ran lost.
I know you were busy and you take that call, but you can watch it online now.
There you go. Glad he can.
I noticed that there are monies that are designated to go to transportation that are going to education.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a bill that was supposed to make them go where they're originally set to go. What's it gonna take to do that? Because We didn't used to be in debt for roads.
Number one, the first thing it takes is your top leadership at the statewide level to where they all say, you know what? When you start a legislative session, I may have something that's important to me or that I think is really critical, you know, whether it's driver's license waiting lines. Have you been to one of those lately? I thought about that today as I drove by and saw a sign, and it made me think about some of my constituents and the problems they have. Whether that's something that I push hard for, or where another legislator may have, well, we need to make sure we get the money all going to transportation. But the first foremost thing is your statewide leadership. Your governor, lieutenant governor, and your speaker having a unified decision that if we don't have roads, we don't have water, we don't have some basic utilities, we got problems in this state with growing. And so that's the first direction, and that's the reason in answering your questionnaire when it asked why the Comptroller's office, because you don't have really oversight necessarily over policy. And I said that I disagreed with that, because I think that as the chief financial officer, you really are looking at the whole book of business of the state of Texas and the health of the economy. And I don't think it's your business to go get involved in every issue, but I think it's your duty and responsibility to educate. And that if we have congestion and we have problems in our roads, if we're spending money from transportation and we're moving it over here, me as a legislature, I can try really hard, but I can't get that passed. Me as the comptroller, I have more or less a bigger bully pulpit that I can kind of steer the ship. And that was part of one of your answers earlier that I wanted to say, as the comptroller, you have a little bit better ability to steer the ship. And you talked about the, pushing legislation. And I don't think you need to stick your nose in every piece of legislation, but some of the most important things like transportation and not diverting funding, you have a bigger voice than I do as a state senator right now.
Okay. Well, if you listen to Governor Perry and a lot of other people when they talk on TV, they tell us that we're required to have a balanced budget.
Yes.
And most of them brag that we do. But when we interview folks like you and Steve, they tell us we're a long way from having a balanced budget. So whose rule is it that we have to have a balanced budget? The Texas Constitution or the U.S. Constitution?
Yes, sir. The Texas Constitution says that we have to have a balanced budget. And then the question is what is a balanced budget? And I think that's the next question you have to ask.
All right, what is a balanced budget? Yeah.
That's really the question. And what does it take to balance? How do you balance the budget? And I will say, as a state legislator, when you first get there, you would hope that you have knowledge over everything. And I'm the type that I get there usually between 6:30. I get there and I work early. Nobody knows I'm in the building. It's before people show up. I get a lot of work done. During the day, I've got lots of meetings with my constituents, a lot of phone calls. That's what you should be doing. But to actually tear into that 4.5-inch document that you talked about, the budget, one of the things it took me a session or so to begin to realize that if $1 is collected as a tax or a fee and it sits in a dedicated account, why did it sit there? Well, some of the reasons it sat there and it's accumulated over the last several years is help certify the budget. Well, because if there's $1 sitting in this cup, then it's like a savings account. But you didn't pay the fee to put it in a savings account. You paid the fee in, say, sporting goods. If you go and you buy a sporting goods tax, you meant for it to go to that. If not, then get rid of it. And as a legislator, I think that I've been able to chip away a little bit at some of these things, but you're just one of 181. And I feel like as comptroller, I can help steer the ship in a better direction.
24 seconds in Bangkok.
And how does that certification process go? I mean, when they write a budget and say this is it, and they say legislators say it's balanced, it goes to the comptroller and you double check the numbers?
The comptroller's responsibility is to check the numbers. So in other words, that 4.5-inch document, the budget, and as you're forecasting out for the next 2 years and 9 months, and when you begin session, so you start session in January and then you forecast out because the budget starts in September, and therefore then it runs for the next 2 years. So you're forecasting what the economy is going to do in the next 2 years and 9 months. At the end of session, you're certifying what it'll do in the next 2 years and 3 months, because you've got 6 months out of the year. So my point is, in part, it's hard to look out that far. I do think the comptroller has somewhat of a very difficult job. How do you know in business or in your own personal income that you can guarantee this is what I'm gonna have or expend in the next 2 years. So there is, a little bit of uncertainty to forecast what the health of the economy is gonna be. But the certification process is, are the expenditures that's in this document, plus the dollars in the account, plus the dollars that'll come in, whether it's your federal tax dollars, lottery that you mentioned, or anything else, will that pay for this right here? And that's what the comptroller signs off on and says yes or no.
And did she buy off on that 20 months of Medicaid? Or was that hidden some way, or?
No, it was not hidden in any way. It was that there was money left in the rainy day account. So when we were there
Okay.
2 sessions ago, here are $6+ billion, and therefore, if no other projections come in,
Yeah.
if this is what the economy is going to be for the next 2
You
years,
cash it in, huh?
you can, or you better make more cuts.
Or make more money.
Okay.
Okay. Not quite sure how to phrase this question,
Okay.
but you've, if I understand correctly, you've been endorsed by Empower Texans, TFR.
Yes, sir.
And yet I look at the scores they gave you, the ratings, and 2007 F, 2009 C+, 2011 D, 2013 C-. Boy, I would have a hard time. It seems like there's a gap there I can't bridge. Can you help explain that or help bridge that gap for me?
Well, one, I would say number one, call Michael and ask him in part to answer that. In part, I said that jokingly because we were sitting at a meeting here a few weeks ago, and somebody had asked me what was my score last year, and I said I really can't remember. Michael was there. In part, it was a Empower Texas type event. And I said, ask him. He's the one that created us. And he kind of hemmed and hawed for a second. I said, you got it in your phone or something somewhere. And the fact is if you look at my scores over the years, if you take the first cycle we were there, and I'd have to go back and look because I don't recall, but I think almost the whole Senate got an F. If you look at the scores overall of the Senate of the 31 of us, I typically score in the top 5. And so, but that doesn't, it's not a great comfort to say, well, wait, a C something or a D is in the top 5. But I think that the fact is at least one of the things with Empower Texas is that if you look at this race, somebody who has worked very hard to make sure that you don't necessarily pick winners and losers in the tax code or in the implementation of that code with the tax policies of the comptroller, because the comptroller implements those shades of gray, as I would call them, if a tax is put into place, and then as things change in technology over time, is this taxable, is it not, is it in this bracket? There's a lot of those issues at the comptroller's office, and I have proven over time that I'm gonna call things as they are. I'm gonna give you the straight, honest answer. I'm not gonna hide numbers. The facts are the facts. But also, I wanna make sure that everybody has an equal playing field. When we did a tax cut this last session, I didn't wanna give special cuts to who, this one and that one. I wanted to give an across-the-board tax cut. Why? Because I thought all businesses deserved one. Even the mom and pop that couldn't afford to hire a lobbyist, because they shouldn't afford to have to hire a lobbyist. That's our job. That's what I'm elected to do. And if we're gonna give a tax cut, everybody deserves to have part of it.
In your questionnaire, you did say you would support a consumption-based tax.
Yes, sir.
I guess anytime I've asked, no one seems to have the numbers. And there was, what are we talking about in terms of if we get rid of the property tax at the state level? Of course, we're not really talking about county per se, but certainly at the state level. Why not at the county and city level? But what type of tax percentage are we talking about? Or are you talking about more than a sales tax?
No, it would be a sales tax. But then the hardest question to answer for the legislature that puts it into place,
Right.
number one is obviously getting the votes to do it. When I was in the legislature, we had talked about going more to a consumption tax and couldn't quite get there because our colleagues on the other side of the rotunda didn't want to hear anything about it. But then if you were able to get the votes, then the biggest question is that one that you broaden the base, as in what is taxable for consumption,
Right.
or is it the rate? And that's where the numbers get really hard, in part as in what percentages you've heard wild percentages, is that in the state of Texas, as you know, we have 8 1/4, because 6.25
Is
is state,
State, yeah.
and 2 on local level, up to 2, could be less depending on the area, unincorporated areas or wherever you live. But then does that go up 3%, 18%, up to 18.5%? Some numbers have been out. Well, but the question is how wide and how broad is that? And that's where the legislature has seemed to get very caught up, as in how do you define for what that rate is?
Well, any idea at the moment what the per capita is of just the state budget, period? Or if you happen to know property tax wise, that'd be best.
Yeah, I had looked at those numbers again here. It was 2 weeks ago, and I was trying to recall them off the exact top of my head. I can almost see the chart I was looking at, because there's a per capita state.
Well, roughly.
Yeah,
for exact numbers.
I don't remember the exact number right now, because I'm sitting here. I see the chart with the state.
Is it
the
less than
local,
10? You remember, is it less than 10,000 or more?
I'd have to go back and look again.
Okay.
That's a number that's just not coming top of my head right now.
Because you figure if it's something like 3,000 per capita, that would be hard to recover in sales tax. Now, if it's 30,000 per capita,
It's
all
not
right, that's going to
30,000.
take a bite out of everybody's pocket.
It's not 30. That
Okay.
I do know. But I don't want to misquote and give a wildly incorrect number. That's why I'm sitting here trying to recall in my
Well,
head.
real quickly before we move on, as comptroller, now I've never heard the comptroller to date tell the legislature, here's what you could do to change the tax policy, and here's how we see that. And these are the numbers we're talking about. It never comes from the comptroller, or really from the state. It comes from some lobby group.
Right.
Well, why can't that be our comptroller telling the public and this legislature, here are your options, and here's how it would happen?
It can be, and it can also be that one of my frustrations is if you get a bill analysis. In other words,
Yeah.
if you have a tax cut and you look at the numbers and says, here's what it's going to do for the economy. And if you look at it, it's always a negative number. Well, wait, if I'm going to cut tax, I give you your money back, you're going to do something with it. You might leave it in the bank, you might spend it, but it's your choice. There's going to be a positive impact there.
Right.
That doesn't show up. Why? Because the only thing that shows up on that piece of paper is, oh, what does it cost the state? Well, it never answers, what does it cost the taxpayer? It's that same number, because you're taking it out of their pocket. And my point is this, is that I think the comptroller role should use more of what's called a dynamic fiscal note, because a dynamic fiscal note takes into the economic opportunities that cut gives. And so anytime you see a tax cut piece of legislation, it just kind of gets thrown over here and say, well, we can't afford that.
Right, exactly.
But what does it do to the economy? And that's not something that the comptroller really utilizes.
But you
And,
would.
That's something that I would definitely want to
Okay.
utilize. Absolutely.
Thank you.
All right, we've been in question and answer for 30 minutes, so we've got a few minutes left. You said that in your answer, one of the 3 biggest concerns about the comptroller's office, one of them is that the agency is too large in size and needs to be streamlined and much more efficient. Be a little more specific on how you arrived at that statement.
Yeah, I think that number one, from a staff perspective, we don't necessarily have to have the same number of offices throughout the state. You look at a lot of the different businesses, they've gone to a model. I'm not going to do a political advertisement for certain businesses here and name them, but the point being is that you don't have to have all the bricks and mortar.
The brick and mortar,
You can
right.
actually work out of your home and go do that. You can still keep track of whether people are doing their job. And if they're not doing their job, then they need to be let go. It's not necessarily how many hours they sit in an office building, in my personal opinion. So that'd be one. Number two, purchasing. Does the state need to be dealing with the overall comprehensive purchasing of different state agencies to try to get a better bargaining rate, or is that something we contract out? Also, is it something that we contract out from the HR perspective? Human resources. Is it really government's role, or can we go out and get a cheaper rate and send it
Sure.
have you do it, and we don't need the employees to be there?
Mhm.
And I mean, I think that there's a lot of different things, at least the Sunset role that when I was chair of Sunset, we had different state agencies under our review. And I mentioned the Public Utility Commission, I mentioned a few others, state agencies. We had this agency that dealt with, if you have a home and you had a defect, you had to go to the agency before you could get anything. Well, we got rid of the agency because it was just a disaster. And the comptroller's office doesn't go through that review. And I think there's a whole list of different things over time. I think Susan has done a good job, but a new set of eyes looks at the piece of paper and says, do we really need to have almost 3,000 people in this office? I would beg to say we don't. Whether it's the Texas Tomorrow Fund, which is if my children, I want to have a 529 education fund, I can pay into it. Does that really belong at the comptroller's office? And we have a thing called the Higher Ed Coordinating Board that looks at the agency. Now the comptroller is the one that invests those dollars that you pay in advance before your child goes to school, but do we really have to have the fund there? Is there somebody better that can do it cheaper and better? That's kind of a short answer.
Yeah, very good.
Does the comptroller's office do anything to help, such as C-scope, sorry about the voice,
That's okay.
the C-scope deal?
I think
There's millions and millions of dollars that we've been bilked out of.
Mhm.
Can the comptroller help to recover some of that?
I think you can definitely look at C-scope and you can talk about it without a doubt. I mean, one of the things that I have, it's a little bit different, but to try to answer your question, I carried some legislation last cycle because I wanted to be able to have students be able to have access to more online education. You know, my kids in Katy or Fort Bend or Cy-Fair, they have all the electives in the world, but my kids out in my rural school districts don't. And why can't they go online and have an interactive education, which is cheaper and more effective? That doesn't mean you take every kid out of school. That interrelation with a teacher is invaluable in my opinion, no different than with a parent. But the point being is, can you do things better and smarter? And I have gone and told people, I still want to continue to promote how do we do education smarter and cheaper. You know, I see how my 3rd grade daughter interacts with her homework online and interactive education. I didn't have those as a kid. I didn't know these things existed. But the people say, well, why would the comptroller be the one? Now that's not just your main job, but if you can find better efficiencies and effectiveness, and if people are wasting money, like with C-scope, it was just an isolated box over here. People didn't go out to bid.
Yeah.
They just spent money as they wanted to. And you know, you couldn't even get online to know what your kids were reading. Well, now it's just all up there online. No, I think you can play a role when it comes to especially the dollars and the management of those dollars. But that's really your main thing as comptroller. It's not necessarily policy of whether you should have one thing or another, but from the dollars and cents, I think that's your job. Because you're really the watchdog for the taxpayer is what you are.
I think the whole education system needs to come under an audit, because there's somebody making a lot of money, and it's not teachers.
No.
And education isn't getting any better.
Whenever I mentioned this to somebody the other day, I said that whenever we did the cut, you mentioned earlier about cuts to education, and some people went out and said, it's almost like your question earlier about was the budget balanced, was it not balanced? But some people saying, oh, we put more money in education. No, we didn't. There's no way you could spend that. No, we didn't. But I was not ashamed to say we didn't. I was proud that we did not. I had a lot of superintendents come to me and tell me, said, you know what, thanks, because I've been needing to cut something over here and I've never been able to, and you give me the excuse. Now, one, I'm about to jump on you because you just told me you wanted to and you should, but you didn't.
Right.
But then also, the fact is that, you know, the comptroller, how do you make sure those numbers are accurate? How do you give people the excuse? And I think public education, we always want to make sure how do we do things better and more efficient. You know, and it really opened my eyes when somebody would say, well, we really needed to cut this stuff, but I didn't have a good excuse and you just gave it to us.
You need a scapegoat.
Yeah.
That's fine. I was happy to be the scapegoat. It didn't bother me.
And the Texas Tomorrow Fund, is that one that's administered by the comptroller?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
And you know, there's also like a dozen other, maybe more than that, bank accounts. You know, what is the Texas Growth Fund and the Texas Treasury Safety Fund and TexPol and I guess the Texas Enterprise Fund. Does that come under you?
No, sir, it does
That
not.
one
Now,
does not.
far as dollars that are being sitting in a fund, you know, as the Treasury, because you're the treasurer as well in essence. And so any dollars that's your tax dollars, regardless of how it came in, if it's sitting in funds, it's your responsibility to make sure they're sitting there. But the comptroller does not administer the enterprise fund.
So who decides where to invest that money and what kind of interest rate to seek and all that?
The comptroller is the one that invested. At any given moment, the comptroller's office, it's not just the comptroller, but you have the comptroller. Current Susan Combs has several different advisory groups, and then also people that are hired from very expertise management of dollars. And the comptroller's office at any given moment is managing roughly a potential portfolio of $40 to $50 billion. And that may not be all at one time and moment, but say for example, as you pay taxes over the year, there may be more dollars or less dollars there.
And that's the cumulative total of all of those funds?
Not necessarily at one given moment,
Yeah.
but the same as the comptroller is the primary responsibility that, say for example, before September 1st of of an odd year, when your new 2-year budget is to go into effect, the first so many months of that new budget, there's not money sitting in the accounts to give all the public education, the 1,040 school districts, a check, because those haven't come in yet.
Right.
Because you're starting a new calendar year and the money's not there. You're collecting it over time. And so for the first few months of every 2 years, the comptroller goes and negotiates with the bond market for a very short-term borrowing. And Texas has the best bond rating of any state right now.
So we have a bunch of different money managers, or is all that money consolidated?
It's not all consolidated. There's also another state agency, the pension review bond, and say for example with different pensions. So not everything is necessarily under the comptroller's purview.
Okay.
But I can easily. It's
Well, who
complicated,
handles
but
the government employees' retirement fund? That's,
ERS, the Employee Retirement System.
and who's their head? Not an elected official, I gather,
No,
right?
sir. That is
Appointed by the governor or something?
that come to me, a family grew up in Brenham and Bishop.
Oh, okay.
And employees are not on Social Security yet, or are they? State employees?
State employees can get Social Security, they can, but teachers, the teacher retirement system, which is separate,
Right.
that because of the federal law,
Mm-hmm.
if you have a teacher retirement system, then you can't get Social Security.
Unless you double dip like bulk of them do. Look at my,
Well,
look at my sister.
you go to Walmart. Work
But she
at Walmart.
worked, there was a school system now that's been shut down. She worked 4 hours. The whole school district went down there and worked half a day and became eligible.
That ought to be,
Into TRS, Texas Retirement System.
They
It should
became
be
eligible to get
legal.
Social Security.
yeah,
That sounds like an urban
Well,
myth.
no, she's. We have 2 people who are school district employees. My sister's one, she got it, the other one didn't, and they're constantly at each other. It qualifies you to get your husband's, which otherwise you wouldn't get. No.
Okay, we're,
Yes.
okay.
Distracted.
we're out of time, so let's.
Oh, come on.
Come on,
Is it
give
that-
me one. You got a good one.
We learned a lot.
I don't know whether,
Yeah.
I'll try to be as quick as I can. Your biography, graduated with a BA in political science
Yes, sir.
and history from A&M. Graduated with MA International Economic Relations from St. Mary's. A JD from St. Mary's. Law in Agriculture, Masters of Law in Agricultural Law. And I looked at your employment history, always worked or partnered with my family's various businesses.
Correct.
I'm not seeing a real financial background there, other than your family's businesses. I don't know what your responsibilities there were. Did they deal with the finances of the businesses? What was the size of the finances of the family businesses? In other words, you're looking at taking on finances for the whole state,
Correct.
and I'm not seeing it in the education, and I'm not sure that it's whether it's there in the family
Yeah,
businesses.
no, that's a very good question. I'm glad you asked. Because if you look at from an education perspective, my first year, and I'll back up to this point just from the financial side of it, numbers is one of my strengths. That's something that I've been good at. When I got to A&M, where I graduated from, I didn't go my first year. I was going to go my second year because I decided to stay at home. Wasn't quite ready maybe to venture off to a 40,000 plus student campus. So after going to community college, and then my second year I got there and I wanted to double major political science. Why? Because I was going to law school. I made up my mind to do that for some other reasons when we were sued in our business, and I felt like that was important to go do. But then I also wanted to double major in accounting. And so when I went and asked, and they said, you can do it, but you're gonna have to take an extra 30 hours to get the double in accounting. And I said, well, you can keep your 30 hours, because I promised I'm getting out in 4 years, and I'm not breaking that pledge. So I did not take the education route of the financial side of it, but dealing in our businesses, the size of it, whether it is dealing with management and helping in the equipment dealership business, the farming operations, the grain elevators. I mean, you're talking about multi-million-dollar businesses. Now, is that multi-billion-dollar? No. Those two are completely different. But if you look at what I think successful people, if you understand how to manage money and you understand how to manage it in very tough circumstances and call things the way they are, you call strikes and you call balls, and you're able to understand data and information, and you're able to relay data and information so people can make educated decisions, whether that's dealing with someone who started a business and they grew it into a very successful business. But if you looked at day one, you'd say, oh, well, you're not capable of running a multi-million-dollar or billion-dollar company. Why? Because you didn't have the experience. But if you started here and you built it up, and so in my opinion, having multi-million-dollar business that I have helped manage, if I can manage that and understand numbers, numbers are the same, but they have bigger consequences because they have more zeros behind them. But I'm the type